One of the greatest obstacles to crafting health and wellness is identifying and controlling inflammation. It's at the core of all complex and chronic diseases, and it's the driving mechanism that underlies the most common symptoms that people like you struggle to overcome. Join us as we explore cutting-edge science and research to give you the information and tools you need to create the quality of life you want and deserve. And now, here is the host of Inflammation Nation, Dr. Stephen Noseworthy.
Hey there, it's Dr. Noseworthy again, back with the Inflammation Nation podcast. We're talking about cortisol in the context of a mini-series on hormones. And this is take number 2. I just recorded an entire podcast episode and didn't realize my microphone wasn't turned on. So I'm pretty sure I've got it going right now. I can see the recording monitor and we have sound, which is great. All right, so let me go back and say everything that I just said over the last 20 minutes or so. We talked in the last episode about how the primary role of cortisol is to help regulate blood sugar. And it does so through 2 different processes: gluconeogenesis, making new glucose out of other things, and glycogenolysis, which is breaking down glycogen, the stored form of glucose that is stored in your muscles and liver predominantly. But cortisol by itself doesn't really have much impact on those 2 things. And this is confirmed by some early research back in the 70s and 80s, where basically they took animals and they infused either cortisol by itself and measured the response, or measured the response of cortisol in conjunction with 2 other hormones, basically adrenaline and glucagon. And what we know is that by itself, cortisol really doesn't have much of an impact on blood sugar. But when cortisol is elevated in conjunction with increases in adrenaline as well as glucagon, and I don't mean adrenaline in the sense of, you're facing a crisis, because we're making adrenaline to a certain extent all the time. But basically, the main drivers of increasing blood sugar are the adrenaline hormone and glucagon. And cortisol takes the impact of those things. It kind of comes in a little bit after they start doing their action, and it prolongs the impact through several different mechanisms that we don't really need to get into right now. But basically, cortisol is a secondary actor that prolongs and increases the effect of adrenaline as well as glucagon on blood sugar. But nevertheless, what we have is we have this general idea that when we're under stress, we need more energy. We need more glucose as a fuel source, so to speak, assuming that you're a blood sugar or glucose burning machine. And the impact of cortisol is such that in general, we expect higher cortisol to translate into higher blood sugar. But I will tell you, after doing this for a very long time and observing not just my practice and my clients, but talking to other doctors and seminars that I've taught, we tend to see the same general things. I'm going to extend and give you some observations in just a moment. But what I want to do today is I want to talk about common symptoms that are associated with adrenal dysfunctions, or let's call them circadian rhythm abnormalities, because we can generally take either high or low cortisol levels at different times of the day, and we can kind of predict what kind of symptoms somebody might have. Or to say it another way, I can listen to someone's history and their story, and if they display certain characteristics in terms of energy production at different times of the day, brain function at different times of the day, I might be able to, in my mind, construct a theoretical circadian rhythm profile, which may or may not be very consistent with what we see in a saliva test. I'm a big fan of objective data and testing, and it's very rare that I will make recommendations for one of my one-on-one coaching clients without some objective data, just simply based on symptomatology. But there's a degree of correlation between symptoms and function, particularly in certain areas, and what we might see on someone's circadian rhythm or saliva profile. So we'll talk about that in just a minute. What I want to do now is just share a couple of observations, what I might call my 2 general rules. And these are simply my observations within my own practice with the clients that I've worked with over the last 13 to 15 years. So I'm not going to present this as you'll find evidence of this in the medical literature. But when you see patterns emerge over time, sometimes you don't necessarily need frank research, objective data, particularly if you're only using those observations in your own clinical practice or sharing them with colleagues. So my first general rule or observation is that an intact adrenal system implies a greater physiological buffer against other physiological imbalances. Let me say it again, that an intact adrenal system implies a greater buffer against other physiological imbalances. And basically what that means is that if we take two people who have the same general health status, but one has good adrenal status and the other doesn't, then the one with the intact or the more intact adrenal system is likely going to get better faster than the one who does not. Because the adrenal system is intimately linked into your core and your survival systems, it has the ability to reach out and touch pretty much everything. It is how we weather the storm, to put it in simple terms or metaphorical terms. And so again, if you have an intact adrenal system, it acts almost like a safety net or a buffer or a reserve that you can draw on before things really start to fall apart. The other thing that I have observed over the years is that we can look at the variability of energy and brain function throughout the day, especially if it's consistently the same time of day, and it's not tied directly to symptoms that might come from eating or not eating. Well, let me say it this way. If you have variability in energy and brain function, either or both, especially if those variations come up consistently around the same time of day, and you can't tie it directly to, well, my blood sugar fell because I didn't eat lunch or whatever the case is. If it's not tied directly to functional changes from eating or not eating, then you probably have an adrenal dysfunction if your energy and brain levels or brain capacity and functionality is varying throughout the day, almost on some kind of a circadian rhythm. And, like I said earlier, what I want to talk about right now is just kind of a general framework to be able to ask yourself questions that will become obvious here in a second and get a reasonable understanding as to whether or not you have an adrenal issue or not. Now, that's not the same as running a 4-point salivary test. If you've never done one of these tests before or heard about them, basically what you do is you spit into a small tube and you collect a saliva sample roughly every 4 hours apart. So first thing in the morning, noon, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and then when you go to bed. And that allows the lab to measure how much cortisol you're making, as well as plot a graph of what your circadian rhythm is. And then we can compare that to normative data over large population studies, and we can go, okay, this is normal or this is not. And, even though that these are my general rules and my observations, I'm always of the mind that I never know until I look. I might look at or listen to somebody's history or see symptoms on like an intake survey that I might send to a new client. And I might see these evidences or these hints and clues that someone has a circadian rhythm issue, or maybe they're making too much or too little cortisol. And whatever picture I create in my mind about what their theoretical adrenal profile might look like, I am quite often wrong, which means that there's a margin of error. So I do not want you to take what I'm going to say next as the gospel truth, as if it is, validated and studied. These are my observations. That's all they are. There is a degree of correlation between symptom patterns, particularly as it relates to things like energy, brain function, and as you'll see in a moment, sleep patterns. There's a correlation to some degree with that and what we might find on a test. Now, in almost all cases, it's just simply better to run the test, which is relatively inexpensive. I mean, we're talking generally about $100 to get a 4-point salivary index and actually know for sure you do or do not have an adrenal dysfunction. That's probably a good idea at this point to remind you, or if you've not heard this because you didn't listen to the other episodes, remind you that when you're looking at a 4-point salivary index and you're looking at how much cortisol someone's making and what their circadian rhythm is, or if it's you, well, obviously it's your data, that's not your adrenal gland, that's your brain controlling your adrenal system. So the saliva test technically is more of a brain test than it is an adrenal test, even though it's still the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. It's just initiated and controlled by the brain. All right, so having said that, let's talk about different symptoms that tend to show up consistently, based on whether cortisol levels are too high or too low at different times of the day. And we're just going to start in the morning and we'll work our way towards nighttime when someone's about to go to bed. So first of all, let's talk about high cortisol in the morning. Generally, and again, this is the outcome of these scenarios is really predicated on the balance of other things that have influence on whatever it is we're talking about. So I don't want you to get the idea that this is a binary system, that all we have to do is see a high cortisol and this is what's going to happen, because the human body and functionality is never that simple. So high cortisol in the morning tends to correlate with someone reporting something like, Doc, I sleep all the way through the night, but I wake up and I feel like I could just go back to bed again. I'm just tired. And so we see this pattern of unrestful sleep and poor recovery when we see high cortisol. Again, multifactorial. Sometimes you see high cortisol and that's not the case. People sleep fine and I wake up and I'm ready to go. And that's fantastic. Obviously we're working with them for other issues. But as a general rule, there's a pretty high correlation between that lack of restful sleep, feeling beat up and unrecovered from your prior day. And I'm not talking about only people who are in the gym exercising very, very heavily. I'm talking about just your normal routine of getting up, doing whatever it is you need to around the house with your family, going to work if you work, just regular routine daily activity. Restful sleep is important to be able to recover from that. And if you lose your recovery window because your cortisol levels are too high while you're sleeping and therefore too high in the morning, what ends up happening is you're constantly in a catabolic state, where when you're sleeping and your body's supposed to be in an anabolic state where you're building up and repairing things, you lose that window when your cortisol levels are too high. It's a catabolic hormone. It's not an anabolic hormone. So the first circadian rhythm clue that we look for is someone who says, I sleep all night and I wake up and I'm exhausted and I just got to keep pushing to get through my day. The second pattern that we look for is we look for people who talk about finding it very difficult to wake up and get their motor going in the morning. This is very consistent with someone who has low cortisol first thing in the morning. These are people who typically do one of several things, and sometimes they do all of them. Number one is using the snooze button. Personally, I don't know that I've ever used the snooze button. And I know people personally, actually in my family, who, the snooze button on their alarm clock, if people even have alarm clocks anymore, because I think we all use our smartphones and our smart watches. But back in the day when plastic alarm clocks were what everyone had, the word snooze, the letters was actually worn off, and there was a little dent in the middle of that button because they hit that button so many times. And so low cortisol in the morning basically means that you lack that spark that says, hey brain, wake up and gear up the energy production. We have a day to go tackle. And so people with low morning cortisol tend to use the snooze button a lot. Once they wake up, they typically do one of two things. It's like, talk to the hand. Don't talk to me until I have my second cup of coffee. I don't feel human until it's 10 or 11 o'clock. Or people who have low cortisol have learned just simply by trial and error that if they get up, go to the gym, or engage in some kind of early morning exercise, then they can function throughout the rest of the day. And we hear it fairly frequently. Someone says, Doc, if I miss my morning workout, I can't focus, or my energy is not great through the rest of the day. These are big clues. Again, not diagnostic, but indicative. These are big clues that someone's got low morning cortisol. Hi there, it's Dr. Noseworthy. I want to extend my appreciation to all of you in the Inflammation Nation who have helped my podcast become a great success in these first few months. I truly appreciate you. Also wanted to let you know about my brand new do-it-yourself online program called the 5-Step Gut Protocol. I designed this program for people who want to take charge of their own health and stop waiting around for someone else to tell them what to do. I've combined old naturopathic principles with cutting-edge research to create a truly unique program that will help you construct your own gut protocol. If you've ever wondered if you have gut infections, a leaky gut, or a bad microbiome, then this program will walk you through the steps to figure that out and gives you the tools that you need to formulate a practical strategy to help make things better. I guarantee at the end of this course, you'll know more about your gut than your doctor does, and you will feel confident that you know how to address your unique situation. You can check it out at my website at www.drnoseworthy.com. That's drnoseworthy.com. And just look for the tab at the top that says The Programs. Thanks for listening. So that's the morning picture. Now, there are nuances and variations. These are kind of the general patterns that I've seen over the last 13 years or so. What about high and low cortisol around noon? Well, with high cortisol, there tends not to be a consistent pattern. It really depends on whether or not somebody has a problem with high blood sugar to begin with. If somebody has like an insulin resistant, or maybe they're pre-diabetic or actually have, say, type 2 diabetes, a high cortisol around lunchtime will tend to translate into a higher than normal blood sugar response to whatever it is they're choosing for their meal. Now, maybe we don't see that because they're low carb or they're ketogenic or something like that. But high cortisol around noontime typically only presents with higher blood sugar in people who have that high blood sugar predisposition. What we do see quite more frequently is somebody with low cortisol right around the time of lunch, where they start to fall apart before lunch comes. And so like it's, maybe you eat at 12 o'clock and now it's 10:45, it's 11:30, and you're shaky, you're irritable, you're snapping at people, what we call hangry, right? You're hungry and angry at the same time. And what usually happens is that these people are having their blood sugar drop because the cortisol is not there to help bring it back up again. And you're forced to rely on feeding yourself to regain your function and control your symptoms. And so quite often you'll see this blood sugar drop. When you have low cortisol around lunchtime, you see this blood sugar drop. You see these negative symptoms of anxious, nervous, jittery, moody, snappy, hangry. And then when you eat and you're a totally different person. In fact, you might remember, I don't watch TV, anymore. And we haven't had cable in our house for, since the kids were young, and all my kids are gone now, out of the house. I don't mean gone. And, there was, I think it was Snickers, they had a series of commercials like Don't Be a Diva. And they would show a person who was having one of these blood sugar attacks, and then, poof, they change into some well-known diva, like a gospel singer or R&B singer or whatever. And then someone gives them a Snickers bar, and the moment they bite into it, they turn back into themselves. And it was playing off this very common thing that when you have low adrenals and low blood sugar and your blood sugar crashes, you turn into a different person. But as soon as you eat, you feel better and more like yourself. Obviously, the solution is not great. I do not recommend you eat a Snickers bar if your blood sugar is dropping. It's probably the worst thing that you can do because it promotes more instability down the road. Different conversation for a different day. So again, very common pattern. Low cortisol towards lunchtime tends to promote reactive or functional hypoglycemia. Blood sugar drops. We get these hangry episodes, and then we eat and we feel better again for a period of time. And then the middle of the afternoon, again, kind of like the lunchtime, not too many really discrete correlations with high cortisol in the middle of the afternoon. That really kind of depends on their pre-existing control of high blood sugar states. Let's focus on the low cortisol because we see this more consistently, at least with symptom correlation. This is the person who says like 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I got to go take a nap, or I can't focus. I got to shut my door and pretend that I'm busy doing other things because I just can't process information. And I don't want someone coming asking me questions about the work that I'm doing. Or maybe it's the time, like, every 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I start feeling tired. My brain's not working. I got to go get some coffee to kind of snap out of it and make myself more productive. So that mid-afternoon slump, and it can happen obviously at different times for different people. The general window is from 2 to 4-ish, somewhere around there. If you find that you are consistently in that slump, energy's down, brain's not working, maybe your mood just destabilizes, and you need either a nap, or you just need to kind of shut the world out for a while, or you need some kind of a stimulant to pick you back up again, chances are you've got some low cortisol issues. And actually, before I go on to the nighttime, let me mention this. Because this is the second time I'm recording this particular episode, I can't remember what I've already said that I said in the first take that I didn't have my audio. But when you look at these symptom patterns, as I said earlier, just because the symptoms are there doesn't mean that is the circadian rhythm that you're dealing with. It's just highly indicative. It's not diagnostic. So it's almost always better to run a formal test and get the objective data. But when you have an adrenal dysfunction that you can prove through some objective scientific data, adrenal dysfunction always occurs as a result of something else. There are no primary adrenal dysfunctions. And someone might say, well, what about Cushing's or Addison's disease? I mentioned this in one of the earlier episodes talking about cortisol. Well, okay, I understand your point, but Addison's disease is an autoimmune hypoadrenia. Your adrenal system is being attacked by your immune system. The primary problem there is your immune dysfunction. It's not the adrenal gland. So no matter how you slice it, anytime you have an adrenal dysfunction, you're always looking to find and fix the cause of that, which is multiple and varied for two reasons. One reason really is that your adrenal system is linked into everything else because it is part of your survival mechanism. It must, by design, be able to reach out and touch things. And as a result, other things can reach in and touch it and cause dysregulation. And so whether your adrenal system is out of whack because you've got constant stressors that you can't control or you haven't dealt with, or maybe it's these internal metabolic imbalances, whether it is blood sugar issues or chronic infections or a leaky gut, or H. pylori, or systemic candida, or you've had head injuries, or, the list grows the more you want to think about it and talk about it. The point is this, is that it's not sufficient for someone like me, a functional medicine practitioner, to run a saliva test and go, oh, you've got this problem and that problem, here's your adrenal supplements, and then think, I've done my job. That's not okay. We generally want to support the adrenal system so that it functions better while we are finding and fixing the things that caused it to begin with. And unfortunately, sometimes it's more than one thing, and they're all kind of linked together in these vicious loops. And so for some people, their adrenals don't sort out for months on end until we deal with whatever list of things that we're dealing with, which is the benefit of doing adequate testing up front so you really know what you're dealing with. Now, there are some people who have minor adrenal issues that are secondary to transient stressors that we expect to resolve very quickly. But as a general rule, at least if you're in my world, most of my clients have fairly complex scenarios. So if someone comes to me, it's usually with multiple health complaints. There's a very high percentage of my clients that have some form of autoimmunity, if not polyautoimmunity. I expect them to have some degree of adrenal dysfunction, and I can look at their symptoms like we're talking about today and get a reasonable expectation of what things look like. But I always suspend judgment until the saliva test comes back if we've agreed that that's what we want to test for, or part of what we want to test for. All right, that's just a caveat. Let's talk about the final scenario, which is nighttime cortisol and the impact on sleep. So with high cortisol at night, there's a general expectation that that will interfere with your ability to fall asleep. And that's very simply because cortisol inhibits the production of melatonin. Melatonin is your primary sleep hormone that's responsible for the onset of sleep. It's also involved in sleep maintenance to a degree as the nocturnal hours continue to progress. But because this relationship where cortisol inhibits melatonin, by the way, it's a bidirectional relationship. Melatonin also inhibits cortisol. That if somebody reports to me, like, I lie in bed and it takes me 45 minutes to an hour to fall asleep, one of the things I'm considering is you might have some high cortisol at night. How do we define that? We do a saliva test and we actually check what your levels are. So that's one fairly predictable and consistent pattern that tends to show up. High cortisol at night, difficulty falling asleep. There are other mechanisms that can drive that as well, and they can coexist. Because this relationship between high cortisol inhibiting melatonin, and now you just can't trigger the mechanisms that let you fall asleep easily. But what about low blood sugar? Well, with low blood sugar at night, particularly if it is paired with low blood sugar in the morning, what we typically expect is that that person has consistently low cortisol throughout the night while they're sleeping, what we call nocturnal hypocortisolemia. And what ends up happening, without going into too much detail, and I think what I might do is break this out in our next episode and talk about this part in more detail, just because it is such a common problem, is that when people, let's say you fall asleep pretty easily, but they don't stay asleep. Falling asleep is kind of one set of mechanisms. Staying asleep all night is another set of mechanisms. And then how you wake up refreshed and rested or not is tied into that and a few other things. And so you can't just simply ask hey, how do you sleep? Well, I sleep pretty fine. Sometimes that means I'm waking up 3 or 4 times, but I've been doing it for 30 years and I just think it's normal. Well, my sleep is fine. Well, no, it's not fine. You know what fine sleep is? You fall asleep easily, you stay asleep all night long, and you wake up feeling rested and ready for your day. That's normal. If you don't have that, I'm telling you right now, clinically, and again, this is observation, 80% of the time, if you fall into that picture and that symptom pattern, you've got an adrenal blood sugar control regulation issue. That's where we find the answers to those problems most frequently. Let me go back because I'm getting off on a bunny trail. Low cortisol at night, particularly if it is paired with low cortisol in the morning, implies that we have low nocturnal cortisol. And what that allows, again, without going into details, is somewhere, let's say you go to bed at 11 o'clock at night, somewhere around 2 o'clock in the morning, your blood sugar drops. You can't compensate with cortisol production to make more cortisol through gluconeogenesis and glycogenolysis. And all of a sudden, your brain wakes up when it shouldn't because it's lacking fuel, and now it wants to go find it somehow. And then you wake up, and then hopefully you just go back to sleep because your body kind of kicks into a backup plan. And I'm going to detail what that backup plan looks like in the next episode. So let me review, and I'll tell you what we'll talk about next episode. Number one, high cortisol at night tends to promote poor sleep onset because it inhibits melatonin, or at least has a probability of. And then low cortisol at night tends to lead into frequent waking events, not being able to sleep through the night, which obviously then tends to translate to morning fatigue and other problems. Let me repeat one thing that I just said that I think is important. Anytime that you have energy and brain and mood variations throughout the day that come at particularly specific times or cyclical patterns throughout the day, anytime that you have problems with sleep onset, sleep maintenance, or how rested you are first thing in the morning, if you have learned to rely on hitting your snooze button, using coffee or other stimulants like nicotine, or exercise to keep your brain and your energy going, you have an issue. And you probably need to have somebody figure it out with you. All right, next time we're going to talk about the scale and spectrum of these nocturnal waking events and we'll describe that scenario again, and I'm only doing it just because it's so common. If you haven't already subscribed, please do so. Hit that follow button. And don't know where you're listening to the Inflammation Nation podcast, but if you switch over to listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, those are the two main platforms. We're trying to get ranked so we can show up in those podcast platforms and find more people who have issues that maybe we can help. So we'd appreciate that if you could rate, follow, and subscribe, maybe even leave a comment. Let other people help other people. Trying to close this out and it's not working. Help other people find the information they need. All right, thanks for listening. Thank you so much for listening to the Inflammation Nation. If you found this episode valuable, please rate, review, and subscribe to our podcast. Be the first to know when a new episode drops so that you can stay on top of your game. It also helps others like you find the answers they need. And why not head over to my main website, drnoseworthy.com, that's drnoseworthy.com, to explore my personalized functional medicine coaching programs, submit a question to the podcast, maybe take a quiz, or even reach out to me using the contact form that you can find there. We'll see you next time.